Welcome back to the great Shilabo Air War. Now, for anyone watching the previous video, I sort of got to this stage, and for some reason I thought that I need to expand this screen out. Yeah, okay, because you can't see where my mouse is. It's over the map, so these things are off board. So anyway, not a problem. Now, I figured out what it was. It took me a while, but it was actually just a simple thing. I'd gone in there to add something to say that if it was an air transport unit, that it wouldn't count. But I said if it was an basically the logic was reversed. All I had to do is change an equals for not equals sign, and it suddenly started working. It should work now. So basically, if I just do that, it goes into air superiority. Everything else should be fine now. These things have become seemingly more complex over time, but let's just see. Sort of lost the drama of it now, and it's secondary to the original video. But so we're doing the great air superiority battle, and I just thought I would do this for a laugh, but the humour's slightly off now that it's sort of divorced from its predecessor. But nonetheless, let's see what happens. Ethiopia has air superiority. That's what you might imagine. And so we had 5 rounds, which, to be quite honest, probably means that the Ethiopians won every time. Oh no. Attacker aborted. Defender eliminated. Attacker eliminated. Defender eliminated. Defender aborted. So defender eliminated. Defender. So the Ethiopians should still have. Somalians should still have 1 aircraft when we go back. So they've got 3 aircraft available. We end the turn. They've still got one unit, but they've got 3 units in air superiority and 3 units available. So this puts the Somalians in a really weak position, and I just sort of wanted to do that really, just to sort of see how that would work. So much so that I'm just going to play it again, because you might make this a few more than 2 minutes. So we're in the same scenario. We're going to play it. Now, let's not worry about all the movements. Obviously, we're going to take this flank's got the center here. Pretty much end up where we were before, but let's just check that it all works. Put all these units into air superiority. That's what we're trying to do. So we're not attacking these ground units, which we could on the first turn. We're going to try and claim air superiority. So we end the turn. Now, unfortunately, the Ethiopians have 5 units. So when they claim air superiority, did they have that? What happened there? So you see they just sort of appear. One, two, three, four, 5. One, two, three, four, 5. My brain can't do all these sort of things that might be going wrong. Oh! Ethiopia still has air superiority, but it was a lot more heavily thought. What happens when you've got AA? The attacker was aborted. That's right. So it doesn't go back into the airport. It basically is still available. I think. And the attacker was aborted. So they've theoretically lost 2 airplanes. Defender eliminated. Defender aborted. Standoff. Defender eliminated. So the defender, in theory, lost 2 aircraft, and the attacker aborted. So that gives them 3 aircraft. Defender eliminated. Defender aborted. Defender eliminated. So the defender should still have 1 unit, in theory. So we put all our aircraft in there. We've got 3 available, but we can't take them out. Yeah, that was the one that was aborted. So we go back to Ethiopia. That was right. These were the 2 that were aborted. Attacker aborted, attacker aborted. They were unavailable because they've been aborted, so they're no longer available. It all makes sense. It's just, as I said, every time something goes like that, I start thinking, oh God, it's all just rubbish. It doesn't work. But it does. That was sort of how it was. I'm going to just do this one more time. I'm sort of hoping that the Somalians will win. You know, I remember testing this on the Greek scenario, and the results came out, you know, in that nature. But they've won both times. The Ethiopians have won both times in this. And you have to put it into that plus thing. That's why it's there. A lot of these things just about work. So now the Ethiopians are going to try air superiority again. So we're going to put everything in. We don't have to. We could just put 3 in and really make it a sort of an equal thing. But Ethiopia again has air superiority, but 1 attacker was eliminated. So they should be down to at least 5 aircraft now. Defender aborted, so the Somalians should still have 2 aircraft. So at the moment they've still got 2 at least. An attacker eliminated, so wow, this is interesting. This is very interesting, because what these numbers are telling us is that the attacker lost 2 aircraft, so the Ethiopians have now only got 3, and the defender, all their aircraft were aborted, which means they just went back to base. So if we come back in here, we can see they've got air superiority because a number of aircraft were aborted. But when we go back into here, what we'll find is that they've got all their aircraft, and that is all the Ethiopians have. And so what we can do now, we can go up for another round of combat, and this is almost unbelievably tense. I was watching some snooker the other day. I'm not into snooker at all, but I just watched this video. It just seemed sort of strange. And this person, he needed snookers to win, but he needed 7 snookers, and it was like quite an important match. I can't remember what it was, and he got 7 snookers. You know, he managed to do it, and it was like one of these unreal events. And I was watching it, and I could almost sense, even though I don't really even know anything about snooker, it was quite, you know, it's clearly a sort of, you could tell by the way the commentators were talking that it was quite sort of intense. But this is, I mean, it's not like 7 snookers, isn't it? But, you know, this has now brought the campaign, you know, towards, this is why I put 5 against 3, because I figured in my mind's eye that, you know, it's possible that the Ethiopians could, the Somalians could come out on top, but not likely. But in this scenario, we'll see when we click this button. And look at that, quite a big, I won't go into how the results work because it's boring, but basically you stack around and it goes around and it just keeps on until you've got a result. It does actually work quite well. But so in this instance, the attacker was eliminated, so that was a Somalian aircraft that was lost. There was a defender aborted, so the Ethiopians have 1 alive still. There was a standoff. There was a second defender aborted. So the Ethiopians now have 2 aircraft still, and there was an attacker aborted. So the Ethiopians still have 2 aircraft. There was a standoff, and there's a defender eliminated. So the attacker was eliminated, defender was eliminated. So both sides should have basically. Oh, this is quite interesting, because if we now go back, we've got 1 aircraft there. We can't, because we've not got this pool. He's committed, so he can't do anything now. The reason we've not got the pool there to sort of drag him out is because he's done his turn, but there are no there are no units left to use. I mean, in theory, we should still have it visible, but basically there are no valid moves, so that could almost be justified like that. But if we do this, this will be very interesting, because now we've got these 2 aircraft here. Now, just to sort of demonstrate what I'm talking about, the Ethiopians actually have 2 aircraft if we look at those results and interpret them properly. And we're going to just see that by actually just skipping ahead one turn. We'll come back, but we should see that the Ethiopians have 2 aircraft there. So this is the one that was aborted. This was an attacker aborted, and there's the one in air superiority. So in that situation, basically what we end up with is something like this. Now this, all of a sudden, we've gone from that sort of bizarre situation where we had 3 versus 3, and it seemed quite fair. But now a cruel twist of fate has taken the advantage back into the Ethiopian side, the Ethiopian camp or the Ethiopian air base. Not because they've now got superior numbers, because it only left 1 in air superiority. 1 had been aborted, and he's going to have to wait until his turn comes round. But in the meantime, this guy's still on air superiority, counter air patrol duties. He's now running the risk, and this could be just a game mechanic that might be arguable, but this is how it works, and this is how it is working. He's now subject to because these are both aborted in battle. They were available next turn to come in, and again now we've got 2-1. Now 2-1 is actually worse than 5-3. Clearly, but it just seems as though we might win, or we might sort of hold out. So let's just see what happens. Now all we need is one of the defenders to be eliminated, because we've still got 1 defender off board, so to speak. So let's see what happens. No. So that's interesting. Defender eliminated straight off. So we now have the Ethiopians coming back from almost a potential fatal loss. They lost the air superiority battle, that because of the way they lost it, they still had an edge. And now we're coming in. So they divided and conquered. We're going to just play this through. Oh, now this is sort of, it's so tantalizing because the defender lost 1, the attacker was aborted. Hang on, so what does that mean? Somalia defender, so we definitely taken 1 from the Ethiopians, so they've only got 1 aircraft, and the attacker was aborted, leaving this Somali jet in air superiority. But when we go back to the game, so Ethiopia has managed to maintain air superiority, but they lost 1 plane. Now when we come back into here, what we'll see is that this is the Ethiopian turn, so they could move into the ground pool, but we're not going to do that. So when we come back to the Somalis' turn, we can see that they've still got their 1 aircraft available, so everything's all working fine. And so we got the finale here of who can maintain air superiority, and also the final question of, is it actually worth it? I mean, obviously I think the general consensus is that the Ethiopians are going to win time after time, but this is a potential. And I think air superiority is actually critical in really deciding the game, because it gives you unlimited, once you've got air superiority, I mean not just air superiority in the air superiority pool, I mean generally when you've got lots of air units and the opponent doesn't, you basically end up with a situation where you can continue to pound ground units. Now there's obviously air defense units and the inherent air defense value of units that could take that away from you, but the thing is, I mean, if you had 3 aircraft and the other person has none, you can inflict quite a lot of damage. But what I'm trying to get to here is, was it worth it? If the Somalis win this battle, and I'm pointing here with my hand, but you can't see, if the Somalis win this battle, you won't will it be worth it? They'll only have 1 aircraft. Let's just see what happens. Attacker eliminated. Attacker aborted. So what that means is now that we're going to end up with that sort of blank box thing, like that, and then they're going to come around here and we're going to do it again because the attacker was aborted. So we're going to try and do it again, but either way, one side, attacker aborted, one side will only have 1 aircraft, to carry out whatever sort of attacks they like, it's not going to make a huge amount of difference. But the thing is, I hardly ever do a lot of these air superiority scenarios. I'm just wondering how common that attack. The reason I did attacker aborted, I put that in there, is because I did like the idea that you could. It wasn't always going to be a finale or a finish. When I did it before, units would just get eliminated, and once you had air superiority, you'd have it. But in this scenario, in these sorts of scenarios, if you do it like that, you've still got the option to sort of, I mean, this is now turn 8, and we've still been trying to decide air superiority. If we were playing this alongside the game, what we would be doing, quite a lot had happened on the ground already, and we've been battling for air superiority for 8 turns, and none of those units have been in a position to use their capability on ground attacks. So you could sort of justify or argue that having air superiority drag out over 8 turns is actually quite realistic, because they're fully engaged in trying to gain air superiority and not available for ground attacks, leaving the status of play on the ground quite sort of independent of the effects of air power. So, defender aborted, attacker aborted, defender aborted. At least this one won't take up so many turns, because it should be available on the Somali one here, the Ethiopian one. So we're going to try again, turn 9. Oh, it's quite intense, but at the same time a bit boring. I think it's quite unusual for it to sort of drag out this long, but DE. Right, so this means that Somalia has air superiority. So that was quite intense, actually. I shouldn't have said it was boring there, because I think the result is actually quite interesting, because we've now committed 9 turns. Now, if I was to have been playing that with all the you can see all the reinforcements that have come on. This stack should be massive. Yeah, look. Massive. Yeah, that's actually all the units you get. So if you can imagine, I mean, you can't see them fall to the left and right, but if you imagine all those units coming on, there's quite a lot in total. But if you can imagine that we've gone through 9 turns, and you can't see the indicator because the record screen's too small, I'll have to change that. But if you can imagine that had gone on, turn 9, we could be sort of battling up to here, having swept all the way around here. It could be very different, and then you sort of say, well, okay, after all that effort to maintain air superiority, the Somalis have won. I mean, obviously on the first 2 accounts, the Ethiopians won straight off, and they would have been very different games. And so I think you can sort of say, well, how different would a game be if the based against the variant effects of air superiority combat. And I think, it'd be quite huge, really, because in the first 2 turns, I think on both times, I think the Ethiopians basically were left with 4 aircraft, and they were left with 4 aircraft to do with what they want. Right, almost right from the beginning. It wasn't quite like that, but the thing is, that would be 4 attacks, so you could attack that stack 4 times. You could probably do quite a lot of damage, and that's why I sort of, I quite often sort of I quite like the air superiority thing, because in practice, the way it works, the person with the most air power puts their units into air superiority. So in the Ethiopian case, that would probably be, well, if the Somalis have got 3, you'd be looking to put at least 4 in, and that would give you 1 unit per turn to play with. But even 4, as the Somalis, you would have the option to go 3 against 4. So what I'm saying is, sorry, if the Ethiopians had 5, they would possibly put 4 in, and to maintain air superiority turn after turn as a deterrent, and then use their 1 aircraft to pop away. Now that's not too much. I would probably be more inclined to leave 5, and that makes a stalemate. And it sounds quite boring because you can't do anything with your aircraft, but I really like the way that actually works. And I'm sort of wondering, well, in practice, how does that really work? Um, for example, you could try and do a ground. Well, you can try and ground interdict with air superiority, and you get the air superiority. You get the air units that are on air superiority duty, CAP, counter air patrol. You get them as sort of defensive units, along with air defense units and the effects of the actual ground units themselves. So essentially, it does sort of bring this sort of balance in that you've got this air superior, you've got this air units, you've got this air force, you've got these air units and tokens, but you can't use them. You can't really do much with them. You put the majority of them into air superiority, and you leave a couple out. Like, in this situation, you might use one Ethiopian air unit per turn to pop away at things, leaving the 4 as a deterrent. But even then, that's not really enough. But in this situation, which was a bit of a sort of like an unusual event, it was the third time we did the air superiority sort of combat and came up with this. And even then, it was tight, taking 9 turns to achieve. We've now got one unit, and point again being, well, what's the point? What can we do with that one unit? Well, this one unit can now attack any one of these units once per turn. That's not a lot. It's not like having 4 attacks against this stack. It's a bit like having a rogue artillery unit that has, maximum range. So we could actually start attacking this here. But the thing is, if you look at that, we've got air defense there and air defense there. So we'll probably be more inclined not to attack where the air defense is. But then, what's the point? I mean, we'd like to pick this artillery off, but they're covered by air defense there. So we really want to stay clear of that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we could basically attack these units. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And these units. We could possibly attack these units here with our 1 air unit once per turn. It's not significant enough really to sort of be a major game changer. But the thing is, I think maybe the significance is that you don't have the Ethiopians coming down every turn with a massive amount of air power, and so it swings and roundabouts on that. But I did want to sort of just maybe have a blast with air superiority after I'd made the initial ground moves in that first video, but it wasn't working because of a minor error. I don't like it when it doesn't work, because the video's got there and people think it doesn't work. We're not going to get to this stage to sort of realise that it does. But yeah, I just like the way that works. And to be quite honest, I've quite often toyed with the idea of maybe making more of that by actually, just having some air battles where things were more, maybe like the, well, certainly the Israeli, I think it's the 6-day war airstrike, the early airstrike on the Egyptian forces, but also the India-Pakistan war in Bangladesh, because the Pakistanis, they tried to launch a sort of an Israeli style air attack on the Indian air units as they're on the ground, but they just didn't send enough in. I think they just sent about 20 bombers in, which was a fraction of their overall strength. Once they didn't send them back, they didn't refuel them and send them back with new bombs, reload them. And also another situation, and these are sort of like opportunities lost, so to speak. It's like a what if the Pakistanis had done that properly. But also the same thing goes in with the Iran-Iraq war, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but I do think that it was at the outset of the war. I think they tried similarly at the outset of the war to do exactly the same thing. But the Iraqis attacked Iranian air bases across the country. It might have been that it happened somewhere else later on in the war, but it was like a major effort to attack all these bases. But it might have been one of the first things that happened, and essentially they did nothing. There were a lot of reasons why that were put forward. I've spoken about this before, I can remember, but mainly I think it was later on or mid-war, because the Iraqi Iraqi pilots were scared. Basically, they were dropping their bombs at maximum range. They didn't go back again for another sortie. They dropped their bombs and then they'd leave. And I think there was only about one location where they actually achieved any sort of result. And I think they took out about 2 transport planes and a bomber. And I think, according to what I've read, that was almost by accident. They managed to sort of strafe, almost sort of like randomly, a bunch of transport planes and a bomber or something that happened to be there, whereas all their bombs missed. But they managed to do some significant damage to these 3 planes or 4 planes or whatever. But that's all part of the history. What I'm sort of saying is you could actually maybe try and extend that as a sort of an exercise. But the actual mechanics for the air power in this game is quite limited, and I think it works within the scope of that. I don't think you could do those sort of extended, air battles. There are some really interesting games that, focus on air war, and you get all the sort of little, all the caveats that are associated with that, the things like, electronic warfare, counter-electronic warfare, jamming and surface-to-air missiles, air-to-air missiles, all that sort of stuff, and that sort of, can be quite interesting, really. I think there's a couple of games that sort of focus on it, so I can't really do all of that sort of stuff. What I would like to have, possibly, is maybe like a large map of Iran, for example, or India, where you could apply those scenarios and you could choose which air bases you were going to attack, and then you calculate, whether or not you escaped early warning systems. You could, really use the sort of, the surface-to-air technology to its fullest, and then sort of, determine, what sort of range the aircraft, approached and sort of drop their bombs and engage, so to speak, all that sort of stuff. So you could sort of say, well, because that's what happened a lot in a lot of modern wars, actually. And I think it's quite interesting, really, when you consider, how that does actually happen, and it's very common. But they drop their bombs at the sort of the maximum range, and I'm just working from memory on a lot of these things, but it happened a lot in the Falklands War. The Argentinians, they would come in and they would drop at maximum range, but they didn't just do that. They would fly so low that when they actually approached, targets on the Falklands, the bombs that they dropped, they had propeller timers. They didn't have enough time. They were all dropping without exploding because their ignition. I think these little propellers needed free fall of at least sort of like 2 seconds before they became active, or before they became armed, and they just weren't getting that 2-second fall. It might have been 5 seconds, and this stops them sort of exploding, ordinarily, I guess. I don't know how that works. But, they had to then sort of, the Argentinians actually reduce the, the fuse time on those propeller fuses, those timers, to a much shorter time to facilitate that. But again and again, you get these people, they don't want to get shot down because of the intensity of the anti-aircraft fire and the intensity of surface-to-air missiles. I mean, I think, in Iraq, in Syria at the moment, there's a lot of sort of Israeli air power and Russian and Syrian, air power, floating around, and in particular, I think maybe more poignantly, the missile strikes. And so, Israel is sending in a lot of missiles into Syrian territory at Iranian targets largely, and some are being shot down and some are not being shot down, and there's a lot of sort of debate and sort of talk about how effective these things are. But the thing is, the point I'm really trying to get to here is, if you're coming in with a $20 million fighter aircraft, you don't want to lose it. And if you come in sort of like so low and so near to a target. And when we say near, we're talking, within 20 miles or something. You're likely to get not just one, you're likely to get, tens of heat-seeking missiles chasing you. And, I imagine that it's actually, quite daunting and quite difficult to actually escape. And, pilots, I think, quite clearly they want to survive, but I think there's also a lot of, and this is what I'm trying to get to really, the point, I think there's a lot of sort of like stress on not losing these aircraft, because as we've sort of like pointed out here in this game, whoever gets air superiority really has a lot. And it's quite interesting really, when you consider what air superiority offers, because whilst I don't really know exactly what sort of proportions I'm talking about or inferring here, but when you're looking at the Syrian Air Force, they've used a lot of, and I have sort of predicted this, but they've used a lot of sort of almost civilian style aircraft for bombing runs. I think right in the early stages of the Iraq War, the Iraq Civil War, or the Syrian Civil War, or maybe both, they bought some, they went to quite some extent to buy some ex-Russian MiGs. And why? ISIS don't have aircraft. You could get any sort of commercial plane and use that to drop bombs. And I think they have sort of done that. But, you sort of think, well, okay, what is this whole notion of air superiority? And I think when you've got really expensive planes like the Pakistanis did, and even the Kuwaitis had aircraft, and the Iraqis had aircraft, when the Americans invaded and they to take Kuwait back, and they sent them all over to somewhere else. As well with the when during the Indo-Pakistan War, the Pakistanis, they sent all their aircraft elsewhere when they started to lose. I can't remember exactly, but people are quite sensitive about losing their aircraft because they're so expensive. I think there's a lot of, in the Uganda War, the air superiority was settled quite early on, through a lot of surface-to-air missile technology, but also through the fact that the Ugandan pilots weren't very good, so they were coming in over certain towns and they were actually being, just basically shot down with just standard anti-aircraft weaponry. But I think the point is that they were being used either, not so much to an extreme. What I'm trying to get to is they were either getting shot at and damaged, or the maintenance of them was just something that was causing a problem. Basically, they were going back and they couldn't maintain these aircraft. So they might come back and they've got a leaky oil filter, and they just don't have they don't have the oil replacement oil filters. And that was a factor, basically. The Ugandans lost air superiority basically through the inability to maintain their air power. I mean, they were okay for the first week or so, but with a combination of, aircraft getting shot down at an alarming rate and the inability to maintain their aircraft after sort of sorties, they basically didn't have any air power. And so I think that, when you consider that, and you consider sort of the whole notion of these, the use of these very, very expensive aircraft, you've got to sort of wonder, why you use such expensive and powerful and hard to maintain, fighter craft when, to some extent, I would, if I was, sort of like, a dictator of a tin pot nation, I would be thinking of, sort of actually using things like, much cheaper prop jet, propeller sort of driven aircraft, at least to some extent. You might not be able to, actually deploy them as aggressively, and you might have, say, issues with, pilots, co-pilots, and crew ejecting. But we've had this throughout history. The Second World War, the bomber aircraft, didn't have ejector seats. And even so, a lot of aircraft, even now, don't really have the capacity, especially like these large sort of C-10s, or these big large gunships, that have crew inside them. They don't have ejector seats, so they might have parachutes. But what I'm trying to say is, if you use this small aircraft, there might be issues with, the fact that your crew couldn't get out of them. But I think that to some extent, what you sort of, I would be thinking about is actually maintaining my own air force and my own, air power that isn't really as expensive. I mean, why buy a MiG aircraft for, however many $1 million they cost, or whatever sort of currency you're dealing with, when you could buy a fleet of 100 much smaller aircraft that you could use, to some extent, just as well. You might want to sort of fly them lower, or only at night, or more sparingly, in surprise attacks, or a lot further away. But having the ability to engage in air delivered attacks, I think is actually is quite important, really. And so it always amazes me when they run out of these really expensive planes, why they're not using other things. I mean, I've even, when you sort of look at how ISIS are working, you sort of think, well, okay, why don't they use hang gliders, or or any of these sorts of things? I mean, there's a lot of talk, about the use of unmanned aircraft, but those are high-tech devices. We're talking about biplanes. I mean, ISIS were actually quite competent and quite capable of building certain things. They built a lot of their own weapons. I was actually looking at a BBC article just the other day on the Pakistan armories, and they make and manufacture almost identical M16s. They cost like $250. A real M16 will cost you $1,000. According to this article. But the point is, we're using fairly rudimentary technology, and we're talking about probably, Bridgeport mills and lathes and just sort of standard CNC or even conventional machining technology. You can build certain things, and what I'm trying to get to is, the ability to build an aircraft is actually not that difficult. I mean, you can build an aircraft with a lawnmower engine and a lot of sort of, high strength aluminium. I'm pretty sure that if ISIS really put their mind to it, they could have probably turned out quite a lot of rudimentary sort of air units that probably would have got shot down. But the thing is, when you think about it, these things are so small, they're actually quite difficult to actually hit, and they might be moving quite slowly. But it wouldn't surprise me if ISIS did do things like that, and they simply weren't reported on. It just sort of strikes me as being odd, really, because if you were to have one of these, just for sake of argument, a lawnmower-powered sort of aircraft, would a sort of a MiG-32 be able to actually shoot it down? I mean, it would be going so fast, you'd essentially be stationary. You might be going along at sort of 150 miles an hour. 150 knots, or however you measure airspeed, and you're going at Mach 3. I mean, you'd probably have to go subsonic speeds. Would you be able to hit something with the cannons? Possibly, but I mean, when they're dogfighting, one of the things that you've got is that you've got relative speed. So if you're both going really quickly, you're probably not going to hit each other going head to head. The thing is, if you can come up behind someone, your relative speed can actually be almost comparable to their speed, and you can accelerate and slow down accordingly in order to get your cannons fixed on a target. But if you're dealing with something that's just so slow, no matter how you approach it, it's going to appear to be stationary, and you're just going to get that one strafe. And surface air-to-air missiles, are they actually going to get this lawnmower engine? I mean, is it putting out enough heat to constitute, the equivalent of a jet engine? I'm just really sort of, talking off the cuff here, and but it just seems to me that, in all these sorts of situations, they rely, and they seem so sort of reliant on very expensive, fighter aircraft. I mean, in this situation, this is a MiG-22 or MiG-23, and when they lose them, well, that's it. Now, obviously, you probably are a little limited in your overall capacity, especially with delivering, heavy ordnance. Like sort of like 100-pound bombs, you probably couldn't do that, but you could probably still put a 100-pound bomb under a Cessna or any sort of like commercial jet. And I think that the Chadians did do that. They converted a lot of passenger jets into bombers, etc. So I think it's quite interesting, really, to consider that and to consider air power in the modern age, and how that works. I'm not going to go on for much longer because I'm boring myself, and I know that I'm probably boring everyone else. Someone's going to get 40 minutes worth of video, but I hope you found that that example of air combat interesting. Certainly did, and I will speak to you later. Cheerio.